I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're reviewing the base model Hyundai Santa Fe diesel. The white Hyundai Santa Fe that I've brought along with me today is pretty obviously a base model. This is the cheapest you can get a Santa Fe diesel for here in Australia, but as we'll find out in today's video, even the entry-level upgraded 2021 Santa Fe is actually pretty good going. It drives well, it's comfortable, it's pretty well equipped, and if you don't mind the look of chunky tyres and 17-inch alloy wheels, then this may be just as much Santa Fe as you need. Now, as you can see, you get almost all of the cool styling cues from this car's recent facelift. You get this new, bolder front end with these awesome LED running lights that look a bit suspiciously like Volvo's Hammer of Thor signature, but either way, that's pretty cool. And you do actually get full LED headlights now on the Santa Fe, which definitely improves the look of the car at night. Sure, you do get those small wheels, and yes, there are more exciting colors than this, but I think it's a fairly handsome looking vehicle. You can let me know down below in the comments. As ever, there's a choice of the 2.2 litre diesel 4-cylinder engine with all-wheel drive, or a petrol 3.5 litre V6 with front-wheel drive, and I'm going to be telling you which of those engines I think works best for most people later in the video. We'll do our usual thing. We'll check out the interior, the second and third row, and the boot. We'll discuss the running costs, and then we'll take this base model Santa Fe out for a drive. But before we get started, hit subscribe down below and help us finish the job and get to 100K. Jumping inside the entry-level Santa Fe, what I'm not going to do is lie to you and tell you how luxurious and opulent it is in here, because on the contrary, while it isn't luxurious, what it is high quality, well screwed together, thoughtfully laid out and comfortable. And that's what you want in an entry-level 7-seat family SUV that sets you back less than 50 grand on the road. And that's what the deal is in this base diesel Santa Fe. So the first thing you'll notice is that unlike most trims of the Santa Fe, you get these cloth seats instead of leather. And even at the very top of the range, there's even Nappa leather in the Santa Fe now. But while you might equate cloth with cheap, that isn't the case in the Santa Fe. Instead, these cloth seats are genuinely very comfortable, more like European style cloth, so actually a higher quality textile used, and the seats themselves are shapely, deep, comfortable, supportive. So don't rule it out just because you don't see partial leather on these seats. Now, of course, as a family-friendly point, leather or leatherette is easier to wipe down, so there is that if your kids are particularly prone to hurling on long drives. But if they're not, then you may still want to consider this nice temperate cloth that isn't going to get burning hot in the Australian sun in summer. Where you do get leather is here on the steering wheel and on the shifter, which feels really good. What you'll also notice if you've seen my review of the updated Santa Fe Highlander is that here in the base model we get Hyundai's old school center console arrangement rather than the big rising bridge that you get in every other Santa Fe grade. And it swings and roundabouts. This is perfectly functional. A conventional shifter as opposed to buttons is actually something I prefer subjectively. You get decent sized cup holders, you get a bit of storage here, and you also get wireless smartphone charging on the base model, which is great, along with a couple of USB ports and a 12-volt socket here up the front. Now, the wireless charging is particularly convenient because whereas we spend most of our time ragging on Hyundai and Kia for not having wireless Apple CarPlay and wireless Android Auto, here in the base model, because the car doesn't have factory navigation, it gets wireless Apple CarPlay, which is great. It sort of swings and roundabouts. You know, you might be a person that prefers integrated nav, which is fine if that's your preference. Personally, I like to use Waze while I'm driving, and so having wireless CarPlay is very, very convenient. But you can't have factory navigation and wireless CarPlay in a Hyundai Group car, which is odd. Looking forward, we have analog gauges, which are fine. We have a color trip computer in between them, which works well. No paddle shifters, but you can manually shift the gearbox if you really want to down here with the traditional shifter. Just manual air conditioning in this car, single zone, but it blows cold, it works fine. And in terms of storage, we do have a rubberized shelf here in the dash, which is great. We've got a big box between the seats, and we've got okay bottle holders in the doors. But it's actually the material quality and the build quality that shines. Beautiful soft dash up here, soft doors, and no flex in this center console. This is where I think options like this base Santa Fe set themselves apart from something like the emerging competition from China. You can get some amazing value packed cars out of China these days if that's the sort of thing you want to buy, but where they don't have the same maturity and sophistication as something like this Santa Fe is just in how well everything is screwed together, which is really quite impressive in this car. So up front, there's actually a lot to like. Let's check out the second row. When I review 7-seat family cars, what I do is I set up the second row in a position where it has enough legroom for someone sitting behind in the third row, but you could still sit comfortably on a road trip here in this particular setting. So it's usually around the middle of the slider setting on the seat. That's where I've got it now in the Santa Fe, and you can see that my space on offer is pretty good. Headroom is fine. I could be wearing a top hat. Legroom's good. Toe room is good. If there is no one sitting in that third row, then you can of course push this seat right back, and then you have limo-like space in the back seat of the Santa Fe. Now all the other bona fides are here. The seat squab itself is comfortable, so you will be comfy in the back seat of this vehicle for a few hours. The backrest reclines really quite a long way, which is great. We've got air vents across the range, bit of storage here, 2 more USB ports in the back seat. They're down here near the floor as opposed to in the seats themselves like you would get in a Kia Sorento. Just a small detail to note. We've got a leatherette mat pocket at the back of both of these front seats. But unlike quite a lot of cars in this segment, we actually have really nice plush soft plastics here in the top of the doors. Why is that important? Well, if somebody just gently rests their head against that, for example, on a long drive, which is something you can imagine happening, then it's not going to be that really jarring, bone-hard plastic. It also doesn't reflect as much light up onto the windows, which is another good point. So, all in all, it's perfectly respectable and comfortable back here. If you do go for higher spec Santa Fe variants, the top one has like integrated sun blinds and stuff like that, but you get most of the goodies right across the range. The Santa Fe isn't massive. It's actually quite usefully sized, a lot like a Skoda Kodiaq, and that means that even though you're probably going to have more luck fitting something like this in your garage than Hyundai's full-size Palisade, it still has a third row, and a decent one at that. The other good news is that Hyundai is getting really good at re-engineering its cars for easy curbside access here in Australia, where we drive on the left side of the road. So you want your nice light single piece second row seat on the curbside. Not that it really even matters, because even from the base model, it's got one touch access, pretty much one touch. And while it's not the most graceful of transitions for adults, the good news is that even if I put this seat back into a reasonably comfortable spot, if I was sitting in it, I've actually got more than ample space. Sure, my legs don't have any support, so I wouldn't feel too comfortable after a few hours back here, but in terms of headroom, in terms of shoulder room, it's okay. I've got a cup holder down here as well, I've got air vents, and you could get 2 people into the back of the Santa Fe pretty easily. There's just one big problem, and that's that full airbag coverage doesn't stretch to the third row in the Hyundai Santa Fe. If you want that feature, you'll need to consider something like the Kodiaq or Hyundai's bigger Palisade, because it really only stretches up to the glass here in the back of this mid-size Hyundai 3-row SUV. So it's something to keep in mind, but the actual comfort and the actual space is perfectly acceptable. Here around the back of the Santa Fe, the design has been massaged a bit for 2021. You now get this red reflector strip between the taillights. Unfortunately, it doesn't light up at night, but it still looks pretty good from behind, even in this white color. Santa Fe badge still has the little ray of sunshine on it, which is always a calming touch. Now, the tailgate on this base grade is manual, but it's assisted. It's pretty easy to use. And the great thing about being a 7-seater is you really can choose between having a massive boot in 5-seat mode, where it's easy to get all of our suitcases in, or alternatively, you can really easily, manually but easily, bring up the third row. And even if you do that, can you get our big suitcase in? Not quite. Mid-size is absolutely no issue. I don't think we're going to be able to get small in at the same time. Let's find out. Okay, you are. Fantastic. So there actually is still a good amount of versatility, even with all 7 seats in place, for getting a couple of bags in, just for those sort of family trips to the airport. Now underneath that boot floor, we do actually have a nicely thought out cubby space for the cargo blind. That fits in there perfectly. Oof, it's a bit stiff, this one, but there it is. And then you also get a spare wheel, which is slung underneath the vehicle. Not quite as convenient, but you know, it does free up that space for where the back seats fold into. It's a bit difficult to have an internal spare wheel if you want all of those characteristics combined. Then closing that manual tailgate, it's easy for me at 6 foot. If you're on the more short side, I guess, then you may want to consider one of the higher end variants which have power tailgates. But what are the running costs of the base Santa Fe? Well, as far as upper mid-size or small, large 7-seat family SUVs go, they're actually pretty manageable, largely because the diesel engine under the bonnet of this SUV is really quite efficient. In combined driving, we manage 8 litres per 100 Ks without too much of an issue. On the highway, you'll drive it down to 7 litres per 100 or a bit less, and in town you can expect around 9. So this car is really quite consistent in the amount of fuel that it uses. You can also purchase a 5-year prepaid servicing plan from Hyundai to save a little bit of money. That will last you 75,000 kilometers with this particular engine, and it goes for $2,295, which is par for the course for a vehicle like this. The warranty on the car, 5 years with unlimited kilometers. And in terms of insurance, in the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer paid $876 to comprehensively insure a new Hyundai Santa Fe. Keep in mind, everybody's situation varies and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, how you garage the car, who drives the car, their driving histories, etc. So what is the dual clutch base diesel Santa Fe like from here behind the wheel? Well, let's take it for a drive and find out. So it's interesting that the Santa Fe actually got quite a big upgrade or a big change so early in its life, because this generation of Santa Fe had only been on the market for a couple of years when Hyundai decided to give it an earlier than expected facelift and also quite a few mechanical changes. And as I'm going to tell you, it's actually added up to make this car quite a bit better than it was before the facelift. And I think it's interesting that the marketing campaign here in Australia for the facelift Santa Fe falls under the tagline "Peace at Last," which I think is actually one of the more accurate marketing campaigns that I've heard in quite a while for a car, because the main thing Hyundai worked on here was making the suspension more settled. And even if they don't disclose that, I guess, so directly, because you wouldn't really want to say that the previous version's suspension wasn't settled, that's the main change that you feel when you drive the car. It's more comfortable to ride in, it fidgets less, you notice bumps and imperfections in the road less, which for a family SUV like this is perfect. But let's come back to the ride and the handling. Let's start with the engines and the gearboxes, because there's another big change there. The two engines pretty much carry over in a sense. There's still a 2.2 turbo diesel and a 3.5 naturally aspirated V6, but there are some changes to the diesel engine. It's lighter now. There are more aluminium components. It's about 20 kilos down on the previous version, which is a lot. So even though the displacement, the cylinder count, all of those basics look pretty similar, and there's still 148 kilowatts of power and 440 newton meters of torque, there's less mass in total, but also sitting over the front axle, which is where you don't want mass to be for handling and turn-in. And the engine is even more fuel efficient. It was already pretty manageable in terms of economy, the 2.2 diesel, but it's really quite impressive now for an SUV that sits at the small end of the large segment, but you know, it's still a pretty big vehicle, the Santa Fe. Now, it's important to remember that the diesel is a $3,500 upgrade over the petrol V6, which makes 218 kilowatts of power, but you can only get the petrol V6 with front-wheel drive, and it starts to get pretty scrabbly in low grip conditions, and that includes roads just after it started raining and they're greasy and it's pulling up all of that oil out of the road surface. The front drive Santa Fe and the front drive Palisade, which are pretty similar under the skin, both spin their wheels quite a lot in those situations. So I actually like the diesel all-wheel drive just for that surety, the extra traction. I think it's very noticeable. Now, interestingly, there's been a gearbox change, but only for the diesel. The diesel picks up Hyundai and Kia's new 8-speed wet clutch DCT automatic. And if that sets off alarm bells in your head, it shouldn't, because they've spent the best part of 5 years developing this gearbox, possibly longer, that we don't know about. And what they've ended up releasing onto the market is very good. Most of the time you wouldn't even be able to tell it was a DCT. It's really just that slight feeling of the clutch gradually releasing in first gear or in reverse gear that gives away that this isn't a torque converter. It doesn't have that sort of instant kind of desire to creep quickly. That being said, creep is one thing that Hyundai spent a lot of time trying to engineer into this dual clutch gearbox to make it feel more natural, and for the most part that's worked. It's easier to reverse it up hills than some other vehicles with DCT gearboxes. It saves fuel. The gear changes themselves are quite fast. So all in all, I think from an outcomes perspective, for most buyers, this change is irrelevant. It doesn't even bear thinking about. For those of us that are interested in gearboxes and understand that a good dual clutch is actually pretty nice to drive, then it's a positive change. So if you're in that camp like me, then you'll probably be quite happy about it. The petrol continues with a torque converter auto, but it doesn't have all-wheel drive. The diesel is only available with all-wheel drive, and the system actually works really quite well. So that's the engines and the gearboxes. What about the ride and handling? Well, the Santa Fe is good in this department because unlike most SUVs of this sort of size, bigger 3-row SUVs, the Santa Fe actually is quite good to drive, engaging, involving for the driver, interesting, settled, balanced dynamics. Obviously, quite a lot of effort has gone into the chassis of the Santa Fe. The car has benefited from some Australian tuning as well, but with this facelift, it's all just refined, a little bit more compliant, a bit more comfortable, and noticeably more settled over a smooth surface. Like the one I'm driving on now is pretty smooth, relatively freshly laid, and the suspension is just settled. Whereas in some previous iterations of the Santa Fe and some other Hyundai SUVs from the past few years, and the Genesis GV70, for example, with the 4-cylinder engines, the suspension is just always doing something. Here in the Santa Fe, that isn't the case, and that makes this car much more relaxing to drive every day, but particularly on road trips where you really settle into the car and you start noticing all of these little things that you may not pick up on a test drive at a dealer, or 10 minutes running down to the shops, something like that. So that's great. Hyundai have really listened to feedback there and implemented it while still maintaining the stuff that makes the Santa Fe a good drive when you're punting it faster than most people will on a country road. Now, in that situation, you can really tell that the car is with you. You know what's happening under the skin. Of course, the limits are not hot hatch-like, but there's communication from the front end. You can adjust the balance of the chassis by just linearly bringing in a bit of brake. You can get on the throttle quite quickly, and the all-wheel drive palpably sends some torque rearward, which is really great. The stability control system is well tuned in this car. The steering is a bit gluggy and a little bit feel-free, but it's at least consistent. I guess, certainly compared to lower lights like the outgoing Nissan Pathfinder, the Santa Fe is just in a different league entirely. Potentially compared to something like a Skoda Kodiaq, it's not quite as dynamic. The Kodiaq really does strike that awesome blend between being just big enough for most users while feeling effectively like a Golf to drive, which is a good thing. But the Santa Fe is definitely playing in that league, and even more so now after this round of mechanical changes, so that's really good. What I haven't mentioned at all is the stuff the base model brings to the fore. It's got really chubby tires, it's got small alloys, and that just means that the big bump absorption, like when you run into a deep pothole, is great. Better in the base Santa Fe than in any of the other variants, which have larger alloys and less rubber to dull the impact of those kind of high frequency bumps. It's pretty refined. This diesel is good. in terms of refinement. You know it's a diesel, but it's never thrashy or really loud. Wind noise and road noise is well contained, I think, in this car, and it's good that even the base model has plenty of safety features as well. We've got AEB, we've got adaptive cruise, we've got lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, only a reversing camera, no 360-degree camera at this point in the lineup, but that's okay, and visibility isn't too bad. Kind of looking forward and around the sides of the car, it's of course really looking behind you in a vehicle of this size and shape where you want the extra help, and the reversing camera is good for that. So on the whole, if you've got 50 grand to spend, you want to spend it with a manufacturer that has known reliability and good resale and good after sales support. The base Santa Fe deserves a look. I think most people would prefer to buy, you know, one of the models further up the range, the Elite, the Highlander, but of course they cost a lot more. You do get a lot more though in terms of luxury features inside, and the good news is that no matter which variant of Santa Fe you buy, they are all good to drive. It's just that this one is the most comfortable. So those are my impressions of the 2021 Hyundai Santa Fe in base diesel all-wheel drive form. I think there are lots of reasons why you would consider buying this car. If what you need is space for 7 people, you want a larger and more secure vehicle of this sort of form factor, you want an efficient and punchy diesel engine, you want a high quality interior, and you want the reliability of purchasing from sort of a first tier brand with proven durability instead of a newer brand, then a base Santa Fe is a lot of car for under 50 grand. I think it's really hard to dispute that. Some families are obviously going to benefit from stepping a bit further up the range for things like leather seats, which are going to be a bit easier to clean. But in terms of how entry-level variants go, there's a lot to like about this car. Now, I think you should also check out options like the Mazda CX-8 and CX-9 and the Skoda Kodiaq as well if you're shopping for a vehicle like this. You can let me know your thoughts down below this video. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already done so. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.